Welcome to episode 199 of the Lone Hockey Podcast, where today we're going to be talking about some standouts in last night's matchup between Columbus and Toronto. And so, obviously, really intriguing game. You had Adam Fantilli getting a hat trick in his hometown, first ever career hat trick, which is really awesome to see. And one of which was an empty netter, but two of the goals he ended up getting, which were really nice. And his first goal of the game was really nice. It was a clean wrist shot, just really nice shot on goal, and really jump started Columbus from there. And there's so many guys I felt like on Columbus's side throughout this game, and they've been playing much better hockey as of late. There's so many guys on their side where you don't necessarily hear about them a ton, but when you watch them more in depth, you notice them a lot more. Like they didn't have Cole Sillinger in this game, but they have a lot of guys who are really on the brink of playing in the NHL full time that are younger, who bring a lot of speed, bring a lot of offensive flair, bring a lot of tenacity, are very active around the net. Like obviously you have Adam Fantilli who's playing his second year with the team now, but you have a lot of other younger guys still. Like Kent Johnson still considered young. You have Luca Del Belbalus, who is also playing his hometown and had a really good game yesterday. You have Kirill Marchenko, who's young and obviously experienced in the league. And you have so many more. Like Dmitry Voronkov is arguably you can consider a young player too in that sense. And believe there might be a few more. But just looking at their group as a whole and what they could be over the course of the next few years, it's really interesting to watch them. And they obviously have a good decor. Their goaltending is a little iffy on occasion. I feel like that's the one thing where it's like you don't necessarily know what you're getting out of your goaltending consistently with Columbus. But the forward group is where it's most intriguing because you obviously have Kirill Marchenko, who's having an electric season so far. You have Adam Fantilli, who's been playing really good hockey as of late, and obviously went off to a slow start to start the year, but lately has just been playing so much better and has been producing a lot more offensively. And then you have guys who come in the mix like Luca Del Belbalus, who's played really well every time he's come up, and he's been noticeable every time he's played with the team. So he's been a really good ad for them recently. And then, of course, Kent Johnson, like we mentioned before, Kent Johnson just brings a ton of playmaking skill. Like very similar to Trevor Zegras in that sense of how they bring that creative flair. And yes, they're slight in their frames and they might be easy to get knocked off the puck sometimes, but they're very creative possession players and as play drivers. And that's what really makes them intriguing and really exciting to watch. And I honestly feel like Kirill Marchenko has turned into one of my favorite players to watch in the NHL this year, just because he's a name you didn't necessarily hear about too much otherwise, and he wasn't necessarily a player that was going to rise to stardom this early in his career. I believe he's 24, and I believe he's on pace for around 90 points, if I'm not totally mistaken. So he's already, and I believe he's already surpassed his to point total from last year too, on top of that. So when you look at those things that he's been doing this year, how he's been producing offensively, and at the same time, like he was drafted as a guy who can produce offense, but he was still reliable defensively when he was drafted. So his defensive game has really expanded, and then now in tandem with his offensive game, it's produced a really, really good two-way winger. And so with Marchenko, very exciting to watch all the time. Ken Johnson, same thing, very exciting to watch. They're just exciting to watch in different ways. Johnson's exciting to watch from a playmaking perspective, Marchenko from more of a goal scoring and off rush perspective. And then we mentioned Adam Fantilli and Luca Del Bel Blues. I liked Dante Fabro, a guy who I was kind of surprised that teams didn't take a flyer on him off waivers. And I honestly was kind of surprised that many teams weren't looking to jump at him right away because yes, he was a guy that might have had a little bit of a bigger cap hit for some of the teams, but at the end of the day, he costed, I believe it was around 2 or 3 million. So it's really not that much. I believe it's 2.5. Could be 2.5. But with Fabro, that's relatively inexpensive. He was playing with Roman Josi in Nashville, and as of late, he's played his 5-on-5 ice time with Zach Werenski. So you can't get much better than that. And he's been actually decently productive offensively. So for a guy coming off waivers who was a former first round pick, a guy who was highly touted coming through not only junior but through college, and then now to where he's at, like he's still producing and he's still playing in a top four role. So that waiver claim was really good for Columbus just to be able to add him. add some physicality, add some two-way stability because you have a lot of offensive-minded guys. Like I wouldn't necessarily consider Damon Severson an offensive-minded player. I would consider him more of a two-way steady guy, even leaning more towards like a shutdown style defenseman than he is offensive. But he brings some offensive flair. But then you look at Zach Werenski. Like Zach Werenski is the epitome of offensive mindedness in terms of how he attacks, how he's activating the rush. Like he's literally their number one D, and he's their number one D who plays consistent and plays the most minutes of any of their defensemen. So that's a guy you really want to rely upon when it comes to offense. And obviously, Columbus is going to be looking for a little bit more offense from their defensive core. I feel like Denton Mateychuk, when he was up, he brought a little bit of that as well. Not necessarily a ton, but he brought some of it. And I just feel like Columbus, they wouldn't mind, and it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing for them to try and add more offensive-minded D in their mix because they have a forward group that is already so offensive minded because a lot of their forwards they are purely offensive, which is not a bad thing. It's just if you add some D in that mix who can also be very offensive, it's going to work really in tandem and work really well in tandem with their forwards. So I just feel like having that's going to be crucial. But those are some standouts from their side. And then Toronto side, I didn't really notice too many players, to be honest. The two guys I notice every single game when I watch a Toronto game is Austin Matthews and William Nylander. I feel like those are the two guys when I watch Columbus regularly, and arguably a third. I could throw Matthew Nyes in there as well. I feel like Matthew Nyes is kind of that player who he is a little bit more subtle. He's not necessarily a superstar relative to Matthews and Nylander, obviously, but just in his own version of himself, I feel like he's a guy who is kind of a Swiss Army knife. He can do a little bit of everything. He can be everywhere. He can be a two-way guy. He can be a shutdown guy. He can be an offensive guy. He can be around the net. He can make plays. Like a lot of different elements that add value to his game and allow him to be a top six forward. And just his rise over the course of the last, I would say year and a half ish or so for Matthew Nyes has been really impressive to watch. Like he's been a guy who's become so much more productive offensively, so much more reliable offensively, and a guy who's really added layers to his offensive game. So, like I said, the three guys that really stand out to me on a regular basis when I watch Toronto are Matthews, Nylander, and him, Matthew Nyes. And Mitch Marner is a little inconsistent for me from time to time. Like, yes, I notice the playmaking, the creativity, but there's times where he just fades away and I don't notice him at all. I don't know if that's just a mental thing with him or what it is, but it's just from certain times throughout the game, you can just notice him kind of drift off and not really do anything, which I feel like every player has that from time to time, but it's kind of weird to see it with one particular player who's supposed to be a superstar and he's doing it almost every game. At least that's what I've seen from my own perspective, but I haven't watched every Leafs game of the season, so I don't necessarily know how that situation played out. Obviously, still a really good player. Like Mitch Marner is one of the best players in the league by far. And then some others I really noticed Oliver Ekman-Larsson through this game. I was really impressed with his puck moving ability, and I haven't necessarily touched on him too much. Like he's a guy who obviously Brad Treliving brought him in because he knew him from his Arizona days, and I believe one of the reasons why Ekman-Larsson was drafted was because of Treliving in Arizona, and I feel like he's been a really underrated fit in this Toronto system. Like he can be a guy who can be an offensive minded D and a shutdown D. Like he can be reliable in both facets of the game. And the Leafs have enough guys where they don't necessarily have to rely on him a ton for offense. Like you could put him in other defensive groups and he would be some teams' borderline number one guy, which is concerning for some teams. But when you look at the Leafs, Ekman Larson can be that steady number three, number four who can bring offense, but doesn't have to be solely relied upon for the offense and solely relied upon for producing. And he's in a situation where I feel like it's best for him. Like early on in his career, he was playing top pairing minutes regularly. He could play 25, 30 plus a night. Now I feel like it's best for him to play that number three, number four role because yes, he's getting older. At the same time, he has more experience. He can still produce and what he can do a better job of is maintaining his energy in that number three, number four role. So I feel like that's effective for him. And yeah, I mean, William Nylander, of course, was just really noticeable all throughout the game. And I always notice him every time I'm watching a Toronto game in terms of possession driving and how noticeable he is there and just how he's able to create in many different situations offensively as well.